Thanks, Sue. And thank you so much for inviting me to be here, and thank you to all the members of the U3A. It's really nice to be able to come and talk with you today about this topic that's my passion. And one of the reasons why I like doing outreach talks about false confessions is because it's something that is so easily misunderstood. And it doesn't matter how smart you are, the idea of confessing falsely is incredibly counterintuitive. So it's the sort of thing that I like to talk to about, with everyone. I sort of feel like a bit of a false confessions evangelist, because I'll talk to anyone who sort of stands still long enough, and allows me to talk to them. So as we said before, I have come from Australia to the University of Chester in order specifically to lecture in the area of forensic psychology. Now, I'm an experimental forensic psychologist, so I don't work as a clinical forensic psychologist. I'm not trained to do that. I am an experimental psychologist, so I really look at the cognitive and decision-making side of forensic psychology. And the thing that I'm specifically interested in terms of false confessions, is not actually specifically what I'm going to talk to you about today. So what I want to talk to you about today is how this occurs, and why false confessions happen, and why they become so believable and so compelling. But actually, most of my research focuses on why jurors believe this. Because one of the things that I found throughout my research is that as much as it seems obvious when you know in hindsight that a confession is false, jurors themselves are really, really poor at understanding what is a true and what is a false confession. They can't tell the difference between them, which means that no matter how good we get as a system of eliminating people from actually confessing falsely in the first place, you're always going to get some margin of error, right? Doesn't matter how much we improve this, there's always room for mistakes. And this phenomenon's not going anywhere. And because of that, you'll always get people slipping through the cracks. But the important thing for me is thinking about, well, what happens when that person slips through the cracks, which is inevitable, that it will happen in a percentage of cases. Why don't we as jurors pick up on this, and how do we actually become better at this process? So really, I run lab-based experiments. So I manipulate variables in cases, I manipulate evidence, and I really tighten it down to eliminate all the kind of noise that you would normally get in a case. So, I might try and eliminate out factors such as race or gender, or all sorts of different variables, to try and really understand what the decision-making process is of individuals when they are trying to act as a juror in a case. Now, you probably see the obvious flaw in that is that jurors don't act as individuals, they act as a jury, they act as a pool. And I do acknowledge that. But one of the problems that we have with false confessions and false confession cases is that they get accepted by juries 80% of the time. So if you present any confession in front of a jury, 80% of the time that person will be going to jail, which is why they consider this really compelling piece of evidence. And it's the most powerful piece of evidence that a prosecutor can hold in court. But what I want to do is see not just what a jury is doing, because we know what they do, they accept them. But jurors are made up of 12 people. And the reality is that we know from research, from myself and others, is that probably 1 in 12 or sometimes 1 in 24, so a couple of runs of the jury, are going to believe that that person's not guilty, and they'll actually pick up some of the problems in that false confession, and they'll start questioning whether it's a good piece of evidence to base their decision on or not. But that effect disappears when you start looking at whole jury decisions, because the person either gets if it's a unanimous decision, then that person will often just be overridden by, the stronger members of the jury, and they'll end up changing their verdict to guilty. But in the UK system, we don't have that. It doesn't have to be a unanimous decision. So actually, you could have 1 or 2 people in the jury who say, I'm completely convinced that this is a rubbish piece of evidence, we should be discounting it. As soon as the confession's gone, this case should be thrown out. And, it still goes ahead. So for me, it's been really important to look at that individual juror decision making, because at that individual level, if we can understand that people are able to make better decisions about poor evidence and discount it when it comes to making their final verdict decision, then what that allows us to do is to understand how we better amplify that and help people make better decisions. So this is sort of my perspective of where I come to this research from. But today what I want to do is take you through a case of a false confession so that you can see how it occurs. Because as I said, it's so counterintuitive that until you can really see why this might be occurring and why this might be occurring at the rate that it does, it becomes impossible to understand, or, difficult to kind of really, commit yourself to understanding why this is enough of a problem that it's worth studying. Okay, so this is the bit where I have to try and get it to move forward. Here we go. Okay, so first of all, a bit of a content warning. So I will be talking about serious crime and including sexual assault. So if this isn't something that you feel comfortable listening to, this is the time to head out. I'm not talking about things in great detail, but that content warning is there all the same. It's one of the unfortunate things about false confessions is that generally people, when they confess, they're confessing to very high-level crimes. So it tends to be things like sexual assault, murder, or armed robbery, things like that. So, it's the content warning that never goes away, unfortunately. Okay, so one of the first things to understand, and if you are from the US or somewhere other than the UK, you'll know that, or you'll potentially know that you have quite a different system of police interview and police interrogation than we do here in the UK. So I'll explain the differences between the two. So the UK use what we call the PEACE approach, and that stands for planning and preparation, engage and explain, obtaining an account, closure and evaluation. So this is how the police are required to approach interview with a witness or a suspect. And it's the same approach whether it's a witness or a suspect, because it's an information gathering model of police interviewing. And now the PEACE approach came about because in 1992, it got moved into the UK system because a review of police interviewing techniques revealed, kind of rather distressingly, that what was happening is that police were moving very quickly to an accusatory sort of state with their suspects. And instead of obtaining information from that suspect, they were simply giving them all of the information and then accusing them. And you can see what the problem is there is that if you're accusing somebody wrongly and you've given them all the information about the case, it becomes very easy for a false confession to occur. So the idea of the PEACE model is that it prevents that from happening because you aren't accusing them straight away and you are obtaining an account from them. So it's quite a different system to other places in the world. The PEACE model has been adapted by other countries as well, or adopted and adapted. So New Zealand uses this. So Australia has a slightly different model of it. Some different countries sort of utilise this. However, in the US, this is not the model that the US uses. So they use something called the Read technique, and it's been around for a long time. And the PEACE approach is really the opposite to the Read technique. So the PEACE approach is an information gathering approach, whereas the Read technique is a guilt presumptive interrogation process. And because it's guilt presumptive, it's still holding on to a lot of those problems that the PEACE approach has worked hard to avoid. So for the Read technique, officers are trained in the 9 steps of the Read interrogation, and it's quite formulaic that goes through. And the purpose of the interrogation process is to gain a confession. And as much as that might sound really biased, that every interview is going through into a potential confession, there is a preceding step where it's called a behavioural analysis interview, where the officer will basically conduct what appears to be kind of just a normal, questioning interview. And in that, they look for particular behaviours and particular responses that will indicate guilt to them. And once they've decided that those behaviours or those responses indicate guilt, they move into these 9 steps. And the 9 steps at that point in time are guilt presumptive. So the only reasonable outcome for that is a confession. And the reason why I explain the differences between the two systems is that I think it helps illustrate why wrongful conviction in the US is such a big problem, whereas it's really quite small in a lot of ways here. And our fundamental understanding of that is because the Read technique effectively engenders, the likelihood that somebody will falsely confess. So it inflates that rate quite dramatically, and really is a problem. So a lot of the research into, cognitive forensic psychology and applied forensic psychology looks at the problems that the Read technique creates that it doesn't need to. It is very, very effective. So it is incredibly effective at getting confessions out of guilty people, and that is one of the massive benefits of the Read technique. However, it's a bit like your fishing net. You kind of you scoop up whatever's in the ocean, and you are just as likely to get a confession out of somebody who's not guilty as you are out of somebody who's guilty, and obviously that is a huge problem. And because of that, we're seeing large numbers of people who have been wrongfully convicted who end up having falsely confessed in comparison to other geographies where they use non-guilt presumptive questioning, so such as the UK, New Zealand, etc. So it is really important to sort of understand why this problem is so big in the US. And it's one of the reasons why that in general, when I'm focusing my research time, I'm focusing on the kind of problems that we're seeing in the US. And there's 2 reasons for that. One is because it's obviously the biggest problem. So it's the most immediate need. But also because it is such a big problem, we know that there's always going to be a small amount of that trickles through no matter what. Because as much as you have, this peace approach, well, if the detectives or the officers aren't following that and they're moving slightly more towards this guilt presumptive, or they accidentally provide the suspect with a whole heap of information, you're going to see some of the same problems coming through. So it is still really important that that we look at those bigger problems before we move into the smaller ones. Okay, so that's the difference between the US and the UK that we can kind of think about. So what I want to talk to you about, and the case study I want to introduce you to, is the case of Eddie Lowry. So not Eddie Lowry, the famous golf caddy, but Eddie Lowry, who was 22 years old in 1981. He was a US Army corporal. He had recently split up from his wife. They had a toddler together. And 22-year-old Eddie went out to a party one night, and his world completely changed after that. It's a good case to look at, to really understand how somebody who has all his mental faculties, who has no apparent vulnerabilities, ends up being wrongfully convicted. What happens to make a 22-year-old Army corporal who has no vulnerabilities, no issues with his IQ, speaks English as a first language, what makes him confess to a high-level crime? So now Eddie was at 22, he was at a party, and he decided to leave the party and go and buy a packet of cigarettes. And that pretty much changed his life forever. So what happened when Eddie went to buy cigarettes is that he drove into the back of a parked car, and he split his chin open, blood all down his shirt, everything like that. So, and obviously he's at fault. And what happened is that the next day, the police contacted him and said, we'd like you to come down to the station. So this wasn't a huge surprise to Eddie because, he'd obviously had a car accident. But when he went into the station, that wasn't what the police were talking to him about. So he thought he was going to be asked questions about what he'd done that night, had he been drinking, etc., etc. But what they were actually asking him about was the sexual assault of a 74-year-old woman, which was not quite what he was expecting. So at that point in time, Eddie is already on the back foot because this is not the story that he thought he was going to have to be telling. And he knows at this point in time that something has gone horribly wrong. So the night that Eddie crashed his car, very close by, this woman was held down and beaten and sexually assaulted. She was taken to hospital, and she was able to talk to the police, but she wasn't actually able to give them any really details about her attacker. But the attacker did leave evidence behind. So there was semen evidence that was left behind, but no blood. So now Eddie's hearing all this and is kind of horrified because it's got nothing to do with it. It's the most awful thing he's ever heard. And so he denies it quite naturally. And he says, well, I'm happy to help. And the reason why Eddie is so helpful is because he's innocent. And innocent people do tend to be quite helpful. So he's denied any involvement. He's happily handed over his shirt and his trousers from the night of the accident that have got blood all over them. He's handed that over. He said, you can search my car, you can search my house. They said, well, that's great. We want you to come back tomorrow and do a polygraph just to clear things up and, just so you can confirm that you've got nothing to do with this. Except that by this stage, Eddie is prime suspect. So all this kind of nice stuff is just a way of really getting him to come back in. So he agrees happily to come back and do a polygraph. And of course you would, because if you know that you're innocent, you're going to do things like hand over evidence because you're pretty sure it's going to clear you, right? You weren't there. So Eddie goes back in the next day and he does this polygraph. And the polygraph tester asks him a series of questions like, did you know the victim? Well, no. Did you hit her over the head with a lamp? No. Did you use a knife? No. So Eddie's answering all these questions truthfully. And that's sort of as clear as it can be on the polygraph. We know that they're seriously flawed. But the polygraph expert doesn't tell him that it's clear on this polygraph that, he's calm and he's answering these questions calmly and there's no problems. They say that, in fact, that it's shown unequivocally that he is lying and that the polygraph machine is actually telling the truth. Now, what happens at that point is that the kind of rapport building session is over, and the police, in their use of this read technique, have switched to the next step. So they've managed to isolate Eddie. He's asked for a lawyer. He's been told he doesn't need one. And he's really just in a room with these detectives, relying on them. So the detectives start becoming very accusatory. So they're not asking Eddie whether he did it or not. They're telling him. And any objections that he has, they just simply say, no, over the top of him. So the idea is to stop the person from actually objecting so that they'll start talking about what they actually did. So now the interrogation goes for several hours. He's not given food. He's denied a lawyer. The lawyers are tag teaming. So one will go to the room and then, so there's no let up for Eddie Lowry. All he's getting is constantly questions about, how he broke in, what he did, what the purpose was. Was it just a burglary? Things like that. But at no point in time is he given the option to actually, be heard about his innocence. And it's quite draining. So if you've ever had one of those kind of cyclical arguments with somebody where you just know you're getting nowhere and eventually you just agree because it's easier to just stop the argument and move on to a different topic or leave. Well, this is kind of the biggest version of that you can imagine. So Eddie realizes at this point in time that it doesn't matter what he says to these police. There is no convincing them that he did not do this crime. So Eddie did what people do in this situation, and he massively underestimates the long-term consequences of his actions, and he starts looking for the short-term way of getting out of this very, very uncomfortable situation in the interrogation room. So Eddie decides to give the police what they want and confess. So he needs to move to that next step. So in his mind, if I confess, I can get myself out of this ridiculous room with these people who won't believe me no matter what I say. And I can go and find somebody who will see the ludicrousness of this situation and help me make this all right. Because it should be so obvious to anybody that I'm not guilty, that this will all be cleared up later. I've just got to get out of this room because these people are just, insane and will not believe me, and it's exhausting, and I've had enough of trying to convince them. Now, one of the things that makes Eddie fairly confident that he is going to be able to convince anybody else other than these two officers who in his mind inexplicably don't believe him is the fact that there is evidence. Okay, so the more evidence that there is that you're providing, or the more evidence that's at the crime scene that you know about, the more you're going to feel confident in actually confessing. And it feels a little bit like a paradox. But what happens is that if you know that, that there's, semen that has been found at the scene and it's not yours, well, that's great because, there's a whole piece of evidence that is going to clear you because it's not from you. So if the police start saying things like, there's blood at the scene, or there's CCTV, or, there's fingerprints, or there's DNA or whatever, well, great, because, it's not yours. So you feel more and more confident. And this is where innocence can easily, lead to confessions, because that there's this physical thing there that says it can't have been you. So now, Eddie is confessing in 1981, so this is pre-DNA, but he knows that none of his physical evidence is going to be there. There's not going to be fingerprints. There's not going to be semen. There's not going to be, his blood. There's going to be nothing. So he's feeling fairly safe. So Eddie confesses, but it doesn't end there, because now the police move on to the next stage. So now they're moving on to the information gathering part of it. So you can see how this is a little bit back the front. If you wanted to sort of do this in the UK, you want the information first. So they're trying to get his account. Now he's admitted to the crime. They're trying to get his account of what he's actually done in this sexual assault. So they're saying things to him like, okay, well, how did you break in? Now, of course, Eddie is innocent, so he's got absolutely no idea what the correct answers are here. So he's just making it up as he goes along. Well, how did you break in? Through the door, through the back door. Wasn't it the window? Oh, yeah. Okay, it was the window. And what about the screen? Did you have to cut the screen? It's like, he's got no idea there's a screen. And this happens over and over again. And what is happening at this point in time is that you have the building up of a really beautiful piece of evidence. So you've got this narrative confession where all the details are starting to match in to the crime itself, but it's being built up by the police questioning, by its leading questioning. And it's important to notice that this isn't necessarily a deliberate tactic. So if you're a police officer who genuinely believes that Eddie did this, you're not deliberately feeding him information. You're trying to get clarification. It's just that sometimes he needs a little bit more help. But your perception may still be that this guy is guilty, and that he just needs a little bit of help remembering, or that he's being reluctant, because unsurprisingly, guilty people are reluctant to confess and to give details as well. So it can be just as difficult for the officer to figure this out too. So they keep going over and over and over these details until it's all correct. Now, this is not a recorded part of the interrogation. They did have the option to do this, but they didn't. In the UK, this is mandatory, so it's from start to finish. Everything's recorded, doesn't matter how long it goes for. In the US, it varies from state to state and jurisdiction to jurisdiction. But what you're really seeing here is the very short interviewing of a very perfect version of the confession once all of the kinks have been ironed out and Eddie has his story straight. Because Eddie is trying to actually create a good confession. He's trying to create one that satisfies the police officers because his goal is to convince them that he did it so he can leave and go and find somebody who understands that he didn't. So he's really trying to do the best job he can. And unfortunately, this is one of the reasons why jurors have such a difficult time in trying to figure out false from true confessions, because a lot of the time they look the same. False confessions can have excellent quality, detail, factual accuracy, any of those things. Those may or may not be present in there, but their presence doesn't make it true. So when we get to the point where Eddie has confessed, he's created this lovely narrative. What we have is a piece of evidence against Eddie. Now, he knows that the physical evidence isn't going to link back to him because he wasn't there. But he has now unwittingly created a piece of evidence against himself that is so strong in court that wouldn't have existed unless he had said those words. And the problem with a confession is that it's almost impossible to recant. So the first thing that Eddie does when he gets out of the interrogation room, put in a cell, he gets in contact with a lawyer and just says, look, I could just confess to this thing I didn't do. He's instructed to recant immediately, does so. But of course, now what you have is a confession on one hand and a recanting of that confession on the other. And the recanting doesn't make the confession go away. This is the problem where people like Eddie have misunderstood and underestimated the power of that confession, because it's not going anywhere. It's now just existing alongside him saying, I confessed and I didn't mean to. It wasn't my intention to actually say that I was guilty. Now, in terms of the actual evidence itself, the evidence started looking like it fit with Eddie, because remember, this is pre-DNA as well. So I've got two things there. One is the fact that there are no fingerprints. So, this isn't very helpful for Eddie. There's no fingerprints. The victim didn't get a good look. So the victim herself can't say, no, it wasn't him. And the blood that Eddie gave up from his shirt from when he split his chin open that night showed that he was blood type O. And now the issue with that is that, 48% of the population has the blood group O. So, it shouldn't be a great indicator of it. But in the semen samples found at the scene, it indicated that the persons who belonged to that evidence was blood type O, but a secretor. Now, this is something that I'm not an expert in this, but the fundamental understanding of it is that you have either a secretor or a non-secretor, which means that effectively you can tell which blood type they are from other types of bodily fluids, and they didn't actually test whether Eddie was a secretor or a non-secretor, and they just assumed that he was, and therefore that semen actually could have been his because he was also blood type O. It turns out Eddie was a non-secretor, so in fact that piece of evidence should have gone. But even if it had, the confession's still there, and the confession is really compelling because A, he didn't have to give it, is the way that generally we see this problem. Why would you do this thing that has no positive benefit to you unless you were actually guilty? And because of that, it becomes this really compelling piece of evidence. So the lawyers tried to recant the confession, but it's deemed voluntary. So the judge's job is to decide whether a piece of evidence has been gained lawfully and voluntarily in the case of a confession. And the jury's job is to decide whether it's a piece of evidence that is worthwhile in terms of making their decision. So the judge has deemed this to be a voluntary confession and therefore will be considered as a piece of evidence for Eddie. So what happens when this goes to court and Eddie is in court and quite surprised that this has gone as far as it has, which is quite a common sentiment amongst people who've been wrongfully convicted. They tend to say, they're in court just quite disbelieving that this had gotten so far. So the jury would have heard something like, the man that you see before you confessed to aggravated burglary and sexual assault of a 74-year-old woman who was savagely attacked. The US Army corporal who recently split from his wife had lost custody of his child. He voluntarily confessed to this horrendous crime to detectives after he failed a polygraph test and blood matching confirmed his guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. So this is what the jury actually hears. And the only part of the confession that the jury have seen is that perfect confession. So unsurprisingly, they've weighted this very heavily in their decision. And like 80% of confession cases that come through, Eddie was found guilty. It did take 2 trials though. So the first one, it was a mistrial, but the second trial through, he was found guilty. So this is not the end of the story. So what has just happened to Eddie? This sensible person with no vulnerabilities has all of a sudden been found guilty of a sexual assault that he didn't commit at the age of 22. So we've got false confessions that are present in approximately 15 to 20% of worldwide DNA exonerations. So what's happening a lot of the time now with the wrongful conviction stats that are coming through is that this is retrospective testing of cases like Eddie's, where we've got DNA testing available 1991, so that's good 10 years after Eddie was convicted of this crime. But so we're seeing a lot of retrospective testing coming through. And that's where these numbers are coming from. Now, there's particular vulnerabilities for false confessions. So they're things like young age. If you have any sort of incapacities that would render you more suggestible to police questioning, so very low IQ, even things like being really stressed. So if somebody is being interviewed about the death of a family member, which is very traumatic, they're thinking that they're being interviewed as a witness and they become a suspect, and they've not quite realised that transition of role has occurred. There's a lot of vulnerabilities that can amplify the likelihood of falsely confessing. But Eddie didn't have any of those. He didn't know the victim. He wasn't sort of, in a massively stressful situation beyond being wrongfully accused. So he doesn't fit in with those. And even though Eddie recanted his confession, it's not enough because that judge has deemed it to be voluntary, and because the jury, like anybody else, can see full well that he has a serious ulterior motive to recant. So the penalty of this kind of crime is going to be a number of years in prison, if not life. So the ulterior motive for Eddie to recant his confession is him realising that these are the consequences and he doesn't want to go to jail, and he wants to plead not guilty. So, but in the general public's mind and in jurors' mind, that doesn't make him innocent. That makes him cognizant of the consequences of confessing to such a horrendous crime. And to be fair, it's the sort of thing that somebody who's guilty might do as well. So again, it doesn't lessen the weight of the confession any. And we do hold on to that fundamental belief that a confession is analogous to guilt, that no matter what, you don't confess unless you're guilty, and that you in your heart of hearts believe that you would have fought back and that you never ever would have confessed the way that Eddie had. And we hold on to that belief because we don't know what it's like to be in that interrogation room and to feel that pressure and that helplessness. So how does Eddie's case and cases like Eddie's actually go so far? So we've got the Innocence Paradox, and that is that innocent people are really helpful Innocent people tend to stick around as well. So when something happens, innocent people tend to be the ones who stick around and are helpful and talk to the police. So they virtually come to the attention of police by the fact that they didn't disappear. And innocent people also believe in the truth. So they believe that the truth will prevail. They believe in justice, and they believe that this wrong can't occur. And because of that, they are really quite vulnerable to not understanding these consequences and to minimising the consequences of falsely confessing. We've obviously got also the issue of the police investigation. If you go in with guilt presumptive questioning, it doesn't allow for the fact that that person may be innocent, and in fact maybe you got it wrong in your belief that they had actually done this. So it sort of tends to narrow that focus of the investigation. One of the unintended consequences of people falsely confessing is that the investigation fundamentally stops, because once you've had a confession, that's your huge piece of evidence that this person has done it, and it's over. And because of that, the police are going to be more susceptible to missing key pieces of evidence that could be used to prosecute the actual perpetrator. So nobody wins from this. So evidence either is not collected, disappears, is dismissed, witnesses aren't followed up, physical evidence might not be collected or might be destroyed or mishandled. So you can see that the problem with the wrongful convictions is that down the line, you're trying to correct a huge amount of mistakes that have occurred because the investigation stopped at that confession, but that confession wasn't true. So the perpetrator was still out there. And in fact, in the case of Eddie Lowry, the most awful part of this is that at the time that they were interviewing Eddie Lowry in this interrogation room, and, you know, assuming that he'd done this, the actual perpetrator was also in the station on an unrelated matter. So they actually had the real perpetrator in the station at the same time and had missed it because Eddie had confessed, and that was that. And then really they're just moving on to gathering the evidence to build the case to sort of build that prosecution against who they think the actual perpetrator is. So we've got the creation of false evidence is fundamentally what has led us here. So Eddie's confession, it's detailed, it's very specific to the perpetrator. So we think about facts that only the perpetrator would know and only the police would know. And we tend to think about those as being very separate things. And we misunderstand that, in fact, these could be very much, you know, sort of contaminated with each other. We've also got a bit of a creation of some false evidence in the polygraph test, because even though the polygraph test, as flawed as they are, has come back saying that Eddie is not lying, he's been told that he is, and that has influenced him and his decision to continue talking to the police because he's all of a sudden now got something to prove. We've also got the contamination of other evidence, because as soon as that person has confessed and the police are starting to build their case, all that evidence needs to point towards that suspect to add to that case. And what tends to happen is that it does get contaminated. So we talk about confession contamination, where the confession itself starts contaminating all the other evidence. So, for example, not looking to see whether Eddie was a secretor or a non-secretor. So it's just the assumption that he is because, oh, look, you know, the person, you know, the rapist was blood type O, Eddie was blood type O, you know, let's not look any further. So it makes you sort of wonder, well, what would have happened if Eddie hadn't have had the same blood group at all? Would this have caused a bit of, you know, sort of an issue in terms of how they processed and how they understood this confession? Maybe that, you know, just by sheer coincidence, you know, that could have been the thing that made them look further and maybe not necessarily believe this confession. So what might have actually helped Eddie? Firstly, video recording the whole interrogation, because one of the things that it would have shown the jury is that creation of the confession narrative. So they would have seen it in its denial state, where he's saying, I didn't do it, all the way through to him saying, yes, I did do it, but not actually getting any of the facts of the case right at all, and having to be fed them slowly by the police to sort of knit together his his decent confession. It wouldn't necessarily have saved anything. If you have watched Making a Murderer, you'll see Brendan Dassey, who is, a child at that stage. He's a child. He's got cognitive impairments, and the same thing happens. And you can see the story being woven together for Brendan, who can't piece it together himself adequately for the police. And yet the jury actually did see all of that, and he was still found guilty. But what it does do is it gives you a timeline of the creation of the evidence. So if you do need to go back on appeal, even if it goes for the first time, it means that you can actually see that. Whereas in the case of Eddie, what we have is his words and the detective's notes, and that's really it. Expert testimony helps as well, because false confessions are such a counterintuitive phenomenon. They are so hard to understand as to why anyone would do this, and we fundamentally just do not believe that we would do the same thing. So it would be really helpful to have those experts there. Now, that's not granted. It's very rare that false confession experts are actually allowed in court. Different experts are allowed in, but the court's quite wary of false confessions. So there has been a bit of research going into whether just telling somebody about false confessions makes them think that everything's a false confession. Turns out it doesn't. We still fundamentally believe that confessions are true. So it's less biasing than you might actually think. The other thing that would have helped somebody like Eddie is DNA testing. And obviously this crime occurred 10 years prior to DNA testing, so that didn't really help him. But, is something that should lessen this problem going forward, if that's available to people. And certainly if there is actually any DNA evidence to test. So if you have falsely confessed to a crime and there's no DNA evidence, it's very, very, very hard to get people out of jail, because there is nothing to anchor the falseness of that confession onto. You've still got the world's most compelling piece of evidence, your words saying you did it, and there's nothing else to say that you didn't. So it's really problematic. So what happened to Eddie? So Eddie has been found guilty of the sexual assault, and he was sentenced to 11 years to life. Now, Eddie understands what's going to happen to him if he, in jail, is known as somebody who sexually assaults 74-year-olds. So he says that he's a burglar, and he tells everyone he's a burglar. Now, what that does is that precludes him from any rehabilitation that is related to his actual convicted crime. And as a result of that, he fails probation boards twice, because part of probation is that you have to show remorse. And twice he says, I didn't do this. I'm completely innocent, and you have to believe me. And that's not what the parole board needs to hear. They need to hear that you're sorry that you did this thing, and that you're going to rehabilitate, and you're not going to be a danger to society because you've been convicted. And so he figures that out the third time round. And so he confesses again to this crime that he didn't do, and he confesses to the parole board. And I cannot even imagine how hard that would be, to know how horrendous it was, the consequences of doing it once, to have to put your faith in the parole board that this is your way forward, and to confess again. So he confesses to the parole board, and because he's confessed, that sexual offender rehabilitation is opened up to him, and he takes part in it. And obviously his life in jail changes after that, because it's understood that that's his crime and that he wasn't actually a burglar. So it's quite a big risk that he's taking to sort of get to the truth. So he has to sit in sexual offender rehabilitation with actual sexual offenders and go through all the processes, which again is quite unimaginable to do that. But it allows him to be paroled, and it means that he can go forward and be able to prove his innocence once he's out of jail. So he serves 9.5 years and is eventually released on parole. And he's released on parole just at the time when DNA testing is starting to become available in sort of 1991, 1992. So he's registered as a sex offender. He's registered as a sex offender for life. Now, Eddie doesn't just get out and his world is back to normal. He's lost his relationships because he is a rapist, and that's what he is known as. It's what he's convicted for. He's served almost 10 years as that. His world's moved on without him, and they don't want him in it. So Eddie, even though he was free, he wasn't innocent. And so he pursued DNA testing, and he paid for it himself. So, and got lawyers on board. And the testing of the DNA evidence allowed him in 2002 to clear his name. So 21 years after he was convicted of this crime, he was able to clear his name and finally be proven innocent. Now, in 2011, that DNA evidence testing that Eddie had paid for actually came up with a match. And it came up to a match to Daniel Brewer, who was a rapist who had been happily free for 30 years. So in 2011, Daniel Brewer was jailed for this rape and another. So one of the big problems, obviously, with wrongful conviction is that you have now multiple victims. You have the original victim of the crime, you have the victim who's been wrongfully convicted, and you have a perpetrator who's off creating more victims. So it's a really, really big problem. This is beyond just the issue of simply the person who wrongfully confessed or was wrongfully convicted for whatever reason. It becomes this entire sort of other world of victims and problems. It causes issues with, how we feel about the justice system, that this was allowed to occur, and that further victims were created and that justice wasn't done for the original victim and their family. So, but despite the fact that Eddie is free, he's got DNA evidence, the real perpetrator has been put behind bars for this 30 years on, the original prosecutor still doubts Eddie's innocence in this. And this is one of the things that we see over and over again, is that prosecutors do not tend to admit when a wrong has been committed. And I do remember that in a death penalty case, just before I left Australia to come to the UK, and there was an option to test for DNA because this person had said, "I'm innocent. I wrongfully confessed. I don't want to die for a crime I didn't do." And at the 11th hour, the judge said, "Well, I'm not willing to open that can of worms." And it was quite an extraordinary thing. See, well, there's a life. Like, I don't really care how big the can of worms is. Just open it, and let's see what we get. But you can see the issue, because fundamentally what you're saying is that, we open this and we see whether this person's innocent or not. And what that does is say, should we have executed anybody else? Where are the big flaws in our system? You're kind of opening up the abyss for public view. I don't think that means you shouldn't do it. But this is something that we see over and over again, which is really concerning. And I think that the case of Eddie and his victim and his victim's family and the future victims really highlights why this is so important to understand, even though it's utterly counterintuitive. And I think that the more that people understand it, the more that we are empowered as jurors as well to actually look skeptically at evidence that we might otherwise accept. So, for example, if you have eyewitness testimony, so you imagine an eyewitness gets up on the stand and they tell you one story and they get things wrong, or that they've got an ulterior motive for sort of framing one person as the perpetrator and one person as the victim, or vice versa, you're going to be quite skeptical towards that. But we don't carry that skepticism towards confessions in the way that we potentially would if we understood how problematic they could be. Right, so that's it from me. So I hope I've given you an idea of really the problem and why it's so interesting, and also kind of heartbreaking as well, and why I'm sort of dedicating my life to studying this. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Glenys. That was fascinating. If anyone's got any questions, can they put them forward, please? I will be monitoring it. I did have a couple of questions. You talked about wrongful conviction rates being different in the US and the UK. How different? What percentages are we talking?
I think the biggest problem is that it's actually really hard to know. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is how things are recorded, but also because we don't know the actual rate of wrongful conviction. So there's a lot of guesstimates out there. So I've heard, sort of guesstimates of, 1 to 5% for the UK, 15 to 20% or higher for the US. But again, the problem is that what you are relying on as actual solid statistics is the people who have been exonerated. So, and there's further issues with that as well, because for somebody you can be exonerated based on effectively fundamentally a legal loophole, right? So, or you can be exonerated because there is categorical DNA evidence that you didn't commit this crime and somebody else did, somebody like Eddie, which is really straightforward when you actually look at it. It's categorical that he didn't do this crime. But for a lot of cases, there is no evidence at all, and there never will be any evidence. In the US, there are still states where retrospective DNA testing is not permitted.
Really?
Yeah, I know. Shocking, but true. It's absolutely terrifying. So this is why we want jurors to get better at making decisions, because we want to stop these people from getting in, because once they are in, sometimes you just cannot get them back out again. There's a huge lag in exoneration time to actual release from prison. So I think the average is something like 4 years. So even if you've been exonerated from a crime, that it takes sort of 4 years to get back out, because the first thing that happens is they retry it. So the numbers themselves are difficult to pin down. But yeah, I've heard between sort of 1 and 5 for the UK, and then at the moment 27% for the US is, of those people who've been exonerated using DNA evidence, 27% of those falsely confessed.
Wow.
Yeah, it's huge.
Wow. We've got a question from Tony Skelton, who says, was Eddie compensated for the loss of 20 years of his life? I'm not sure there is any compensation, but
I would have to actually look that up, to be honest. I haven't actually looked at his particular case. One of the problems with the compensation laws is that they differ by jurisdiction as well. And again, in a number of states, there is no possible compensation at all. Yeah.
Wow.
Again, so there are fundraisers for people who are wrongfully convicted. I've got it in the back of my head that he did. I will have to Google it. I am sorry.
Okay.
But one of the issues when you get released from prison and you've actually committed a crime is that there's rehabilitation services, because we understand that to stop people going back into prison, you actually need to provide them with resources and things so that they don't just go straight back to their old way of life. One of the problems with being exonerated is that you get nothing at all, because you're not guilty. So literally, if you're exonerated from prison, I think you get a bus ticket. You do get a bus ticket.
Wow.
You get back whatever clothes you had, which is really fantastic if you got, locked up in 1965.
Yeah.
And, you're a whole different human being and the world's moved on. And but you literally get a bus ticket. So there is nothing for a lot of people at all. So the numbers vary dramatically as to what the compensation is. In the UK, we do pay out compensation.
Yeah.
So it is different here. It's a serious impetus as well for the government to get this right, because you do not want to have to just keep paying.
Says he's just checked. He settled for 7.5 million,
there you
which
go.
I assume is dollars. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Nicola Ronalds-Moss wants to know, how's the Read system itself in the US come under investigation?
Oh, from researchers, yes. Now, the Read system's been around since 1949. So the Read system replaced the third degree. So just, basically beating the snot out of people until they confessed. So it's better than that, but it's psychological interrogation, and that is the big problem with it. One of the issues with the Read technique is that it is a commercial product. It's been around for a really long time, and it is sold to police departments. So they have invested in this. You'll be sold. It is sold.
It hasn't come from within the police.
No. This is commercial. This is a commercial product. You can look up. Read technique on there. You'll see their website. They will have on there, they've got a rebuttal section to all the researchers that psychological or psycholegal researchers who rebut their work and say, actually, this is terrible, and they've got a list in there. So my life's work is to end up on that list of people that they've written a cranky rebuttal to. So I'll know I've done my job properly when I can manage to get my name up there. I've got to write a few more papers yet. So no, and the Read technique is very much a product. So it has been sold into private enterprise as well. So for example, for internal investigations for corporations, for how you interrogate people in order to gain this confession out of them. You will be horrified to know that this has been sold into certain states of the school system.
Ooh.
Now, the Read technique itself is not supposed to be used on children because there is an acknowledgement that it can cause people who are suggestible to internalize belief of guilt. So that's a whole different type of false confession, where the people, unlike Eddie, he retained his understanding that he was innocent the whole way through, there are cases where people come to believe that they have actually committed this crime themselves. So an example of that is like Marty Tankleff, who was 17, woke up to find his parents murdered in the house, and he eventually came to believe that he had actually killed his parents because he was falsely told that his father had confessed that his father had said that his father had regained consciousness and said, my son did this to me. His father never regained consciousness and never said those words. But there is that understanding that the Read technique is not appropriate for children, and yet it's been sold into a school system.
Yep. For what purpose?
For gaining confessions out of kids. Think about teachers standing up in front of class going, well, who flipped over my car in the car park? Let's drop them in and teach them how to use the Read technique, use the 9 steps of interrogation on them until they crack.
Yeah.
Horrendous.
Yeah. Can you make a comment on the polygraph? Because it seems a uniquely American thing to do. Does anywhere else in the world use it?
I am not an expert on the polygraph. I know that it's not a piece of evidence that can be submitted as an actual piece of evidence, other than in some places in the States. One of the problems with the polygraph is that it's so easily falsified that where it's used, even in the States, it's not being used as a piece of evidence in itself. It's being used as a technique in order to get people to talk. And that in itself is why it should not be used at all, because for somebody like Eddie, it was fundamentally saying, we have a piece of evidence against you that says you are lying and that the polygraph is telling the truth. Therefore, you must now prove to us that you are innocent. But fundamentally, it is understood how poor the polygraph is, and the loophole around that is you simply don't present it as evidence and you just use it as another interrogation technique.
Gosh. Okay. I think, are there any more questions? Richard Tatton says, a powerful story, well told. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. But then you're doing all this research. Why aren't you in the US doing it? Well, I think you've just answered that question, really, haven't you? But
well, one of the things is that I don't need to do it in the US because I'm an experimental psychologist, so I can run my research anywhere. So one of the things that I do is I look at manipulating different types of evidence to show different types of interrogation techniques. So for example, I might show one group of participants an interview that was conducted using a piece style kind of approach and one conducted using a US style approach, and then get them to see whether they can actually see the coercion in it or not. So in fact, it doesn't really matter to me where I actually conduct the research itself. One of the things is with the work that everybody in this area does is that it contributes to the same pool of knowledge. And really what you're looking at is trying to have your research be well understood enough and rigorous enough that it can help change policy. So the move to video recording was instigated by work of forensic psychological researchers, you know, trying to move away from things like Read, moving into peace. That again is that sort of work that's been done there. So it's more about changing the policy than anywhere else. But again, I think the UK, Australia, we have the same problems. And in some ways it's worse because they become more invisible, because they really have to slip through the cracks before they occur, because they're not just occurring en masse because of, you know, poor interrogation techniques, because we stamped out that problem, we recognized it, but it doesn't stop everything.
Thing in the chain. What else should we be looking at, really?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Okay, well, I think on that note, it's time for us to stop. Thank you very much for giving up your time this morning. We have really enjoyed it. Well, I have. I don't know about everybody else, but it's the sort of talk that you feel you need to go away and digest a little, and spot things in the news and think, oh yeah, that's interesting.
You'll never stop saying it now. I do recommend that if you're feeling up to it, go into your Netflix account and go watch something like Making a Murderer, you know, like, you know, the confession tapes or the Amanda Knox story and things like that, because now that you understand it, it really becomes so obvious. You know, they're quite traumatizing to watch, though, so brace yourself.
Okay. Thank you very much. And if you can think of anyone in Australia that might like to talk to us about something, I might.
I'll have a think.
Yeah, they're all the comments coming through are saying fascinating but scary.
Really scary. Really scary.
And
whatever you do, don't confess. This is my expert. If I ever get called on a plane to say, you know.
Yeah, Doogie,
we need a doctor, don't confess.
who I happen to know, says excellent and very thought-provoking. She actually spent 20 years as an American lawyer.
Yeah, there you go. You know all of these problems then. Firsthand.
Well, do Americans know? Do they realise what they're doing? I don't know. Okay, well, thank you all for coming along. Thank you once again to Glenys. Bye-bye and see you shortly. And Pam says, thank you, really enjoyed this talk. Obviously, she got her sound problems sorted out. All right. Bye-bye.
Thanks all.
Bye-bye.